Life often places us in situations that test our values, perceptions, and biases. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon in Greenville Park, a clash of perspectives unfolded. A black teenager caught in the web of racial prejudice, a white woman driven by misplaced fears, and a mother with the power and determination to stand for justice. This story goes beyond individual actions, challenging societal norms and raising critical questions about fairness and responsibility. Marcus Bennett, a 14-year-old black teenager, leaned against the trunk of an old oak tree in Greenville Park, soaking in the warm afternoon sun. The park was one of his favorite places to relax and think, a peaceful refuge amidst the chaos of life. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers filled the air, blending with the cheerful chirping of birds. His mother, Evelyn Bennett, had promised to pick him up after work. Marcus felt at ease, enjoying the serene environment. His thoughts wandered as he observed a group of kids playing on the swings, a couple jogging on the trail, and families having picnics nearby. It was a perfect day, but his sense of calm was disrupted by the unrelenting gaze of a woman sitting on a nearby bench. Sarah Whitman, a middle-aged white woman, had been watching Marcus for several minutes. Her body language exuded unease, her arms crossed tightly, lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze sharp with suspicion. She had been coming to Greenville Park for years and felt a sense of ownership over the space. In her mind, the sight of Marcus alone, relaxed, and seemingly minding his own business didn't sit right. Her thoughts raced. What's he doing here? Why is he just sitting there? When Marcus closed his eyes to enjoy the moment, her suspicions deepened, convinced that his presence was somehow out of place. Sarah stood up, her steps purposeful, and approached him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. Startled, Marcus opened his eyes and looked up at her. "I'm just waiting for my mom to pick me up," he replied calmly, though her tone unsettled him. "This is a family park," Sarah snapped, her arms folded tightly. "You shouldn't just be hanging around here. If you don't leave now, I'll have to call the police." Her words struck Marcus like a slap. Confusion and anger bubbled up inside him. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said firmly but politely. "This is a public park. I have every right to be here." Sarah's expression hardened. She reached into her purse, her hand shaking slightly as she pulled out her phone. Marcus stood up slowly, his palms outstretched in a gesture of peace. "Please, ma'am, there's no need for that," he said, his voice steady but tinged with fear. "My mom will be here soon. I'm not trying to cause trouble." But Sarah was resolute. With grim determination, she dialed 911 and began speaking into the phone. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious teenager at Greenville Park," she said, loud enough for Marcus to hear every word. "He's just loitering around and refusing to leave. I'm concerned he might be dangerous." Marcus felt his stomach drop. A wave of cold dread washed over him as he realized how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. He had heard too many stories of similar incidents ending in tragedy. As he stood there, frozen, he silently prayed for his mother to arrive before things escalated further. Minutes later, the piercing wail of police sirens echoed through the park. Two police cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing. Marcus watched in dread as two officers stepped out, their expressions stoic and their eyes scanning the scene. "What's the situation here?" the taller officer asked, glancing at Sarah before focusing on Marcus. Sarah wasted no time stepping forward. "This young man has been sitting here for a long time," she said, her voice brimming with indignation. "He wouldn't leave when I asked, and I was worried he might be up to something." Marcus opened his mouth to defend himself, but the second officer raised a hand to stop him. "We'll get to you in a moment," he said, his tone curt and dismissive. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been coming here for years. I'm not bothering anyone. Do you have any ID?" the second officer asked, his hand resting on his belt. Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I'm only 14. I don't have a driver's license." The officers exchanged skeptical glances and began peppering Marcus with rapid-fire questions. He did his best to answer, but the intensity of their scrutiny and the weight of the moment left him feeling overwhelmed and powerless. A small crowd had gathered, some recording the interaction with their phones. The tension was palpable, and Marcus's anxiety grew as he sensed the situation spiraling out of control. Just as the officer's questions grew more pointed, the low rumble of a vehicle engine interrupted the scene. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the park entrance. The officer's demeanor shifted almost immediately as the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, her presence commanding and her expression resolute. It was Evelyn Bennett, Marcus's mother and the mayor of the city. She walked toward the group with purposeful strides, her eyes scanning the scene and landing on her son. Her jaw tightened as she took in his rigid posture, the officer's guarded stances, and Sarah's defiant expression. "What's going on here?" Evelyn's voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. The officers straightened up, their earlier confidence evaporating as they recognized her. Sarah's face turned pale as she realized the weight of her actions. Evelyn stopped in front of Marcus, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Her eyes locked with the taller officers. "I'd like an explanation," she said, her tone sharp. "Why are my officers questioning my son in a public park?" The arrival of Evelyn Bennett, not just as Marcus's mother but as the city's mayor, immediately shifted the atmosphere. All eyes turned to her as she positioned herself between her son and the police officers. The tension in the air was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. Evelyn fixed her gaze on the officers, her expression resolute. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but sharp. "What reason do you have for questioning my son in a public park?" The taller officer, who seemed to be in charge, hesitated before responding. "Ma'am, we received a call from a concerned citizen reporting a suspicious individual in the area. We're just investigating to ensure everyone's safety." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "I see. And did you take a moment to consider whether this report was credible? Or did you immediately decide my son was a suspect simply because of the color of his skin?" An awkward silence hung in the air. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, We were just following procedure. We had no intention of. No intention of what? Evelyn interrupted, her voice growing firmer. What did you think when you saw a black teenager sitting in this park? How is this anything other than blatant bias? Her words hit like a hammer, breaking the fragile silence. The gathered crowd began murmuring, with several people nodding in agreement. Sarah Whitman, the woman who had initiated the entire situation, began to feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Evelyn turned her attention to her, her gaze a mix of disappointment and controlled anger. Mrs. Whitman, Evelyn began, her voice steady. I'd like to understand. What about my son made you think he was a threat? Sarah's face flushed, and her hands trembled as she struggled to respond. I just thought he'd been there too long without doing anything. I was worried that. She trailed off, her voice faltering. Worried about what? Evelyn pressed. A boy sitting under a tree? Or were you worried about the assumptions you made about him simply because of how he looks? Sarah looked down, unable to meet Evelyn's piercing gaze. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. You know, Mrs. Whitman, no one should have to be the child of a mayor to have the right to sit in a public park without being harassed. Your actions today didn't just put my son in danger. They sent a dangerous message that the mere presence of a black person is suspicious. Sarah muttered an apology under her breath, but Evelyn wasn't finished. An apology isn't enough, Evelyn said firmly. We need to change the way we see and treat one another. Actions like yours can have catastrophic consequences, and we all need to take responsibility. Evelyn turned to the crowd, which had grown larger, their faces a mix of curiosity, guilt, and contemplation. She addressed them with the conviction of a leader determined to spark change. What happened here today, she began, her voice resonating, is a prime example of the bias that runs deep in our society. This is not just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem. We have to change. She announced that, effective immediately, the city would implement mandatory anti-bias training for the police force and all city employees. We can't afford to look the other way. We must act to create a community where everyone feels safe and respected. Her words drew murmurs of approval from some in the crowd, though others remained skeptical. The gravity of the moment was undeniable. Once the situation began to settle, Evelyn turned back to Marcus. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. Are you okay, Marcus? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus nodded, though the fear in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. I'm okay, Mom, but I don't understand why this happened. I was just sitting there. Evelyn pulled her son into a gentle hug. You didn't do anything wrong, Marcus, but sometimes we're forced to face injustice simply because of who we are. The important thing is that we don't stay silent. We must stand up for ourselves and others. Marcus nodded slowly, the comfort of his mother's embrace helping to ease his fear. The confrontation in Greenville Park didn't just end with Evelyn Bennett's firm words and Marcus's relief. It was only the beginning. By the time Evelyn and Marcus reached their home that evening, the story had already started spreading. Social media exploded with videos recorded by bystanders, showing Marcus's fear, the police officer's skepticism, and Evelyn's powerful stand. The footage sparked heated debates, and by morning, the incident had made headlines across the city. The next day, Evelyn found herself inundated with messages, some praising her leadership, others criticizing her for what they called overreaction. The city was sharply divided. At the police department, tensions ran high as officers watched the videos and discussed the implications. Some defended their actions, insisting they were just doing their jobs, while others privately acknowledged the bias that had driven the situation. Meanwhile, Sarah Whitman was grappling with the fallout. Her face had been captured in the videos, and she became the subject of widespread scrutiny. Strangers flooded her social media with messages ranging from anger to calls for accountability. Feeling overwhelmed, Sarah retreated into her home, questioning everything that had led her to that moment in the park. The school. Marcus was hesitant to talk about what had happened. He feared being labeled as the kid from the video, but his classmates, many of whom had seen the footage, approached him with a mix of curiosity and support. "Marcus, that was insane," one of his friends said during lunch. "I can't believe you stayed so calm." "I didn't feel calm," Marcus admitted, his voice quiet. "I felt scared, like really scared. I didn't know what was going to happen." His friends encouraged him to share his experience more openly. "You should talk about it," one classmate suggested. "People need to hear what it's like." The idea stayed with Marcus. That evening, he sat down at his desk and started writing. He poured his emotions onto the page, his fear, his anger, and the unfairness of being judged for something he couldn't control. Writing felt liberating, and by the time he was done, Marcus realized he had something important to say. As mayor, Evelyn knew the incident had put her in a challenging position. She called an emergency meeting with the city council and police leadership to discuss the implementation of anti-bias training. The council chamber was packed with reporters, community members, and protesters. "Today, I am not just a mayor," Evelyn began, addressing the room with the same commanding presence she had shown in the park. "I am a mother who had to defend her child against the very system that should have protected him. This isn't just about my son. It's about every child, every person who has felt unsafe because of bias." But not everyone in the room agreed. Councilmember Roger Hart, known for his conservative stance, stood to speak. "Mayor Bennett, while I sympathize with your personal experience, I must caution against using one incident to overhaul our city's policies. Our police department follows protocols designed to ensure public safety." Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. "Council Member Hart, this wasn't just one incident. It's part of a pattern that too many people in our community have experienced. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It makes us complicit." The room erupted into debate. Supporters of Evelyn's proposal argued passionately, sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination. Opponents questioned the cost and effectiveness of the training. The tension was palpable, but Evelyn refused to back down. Meanwhile, Sarah Whitman was undergoing her own transformation. After days of reflection and watching the backlash unfold, she decided to take action. She contacted Evelyn's office, asking for a meeting. When Sarah arrived at City Hall, she was visibly nervous. Evelyn greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. "Mrs. Whitman," Evelyn began, her tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I came to apologize," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Not just to you, but to Marcus. I've been thinking a lot about what I did and why I did it. I see now that I acted out of fear that wasn't based on anything real, just my own biases. I want to make it right." Evelyn studied Sarah for a moment before responding. "Acknowledging your actions is a start, but making it right means more than an apology. It means educating yourself and others so this doesn't happen again." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Evelyn suggested that Sarah join a local community group focused on racial equity and volunteer for programs aimed at bridging divides. Sarah agreed, knowing this was her chance to turn a mistake into an opportunity for growth. A week later, the city held a town hall meeting to address the issue of racial bias. Marcus had been invited to speak. Nervous but determined, he stepped onto the stage and faced the packed room. His mother sat in the front row, her expression a mix of pride and encouragement. "I didn't ask to be here," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't ask to be judged for sitting in a park, for existing in a space where I should have felt safe. But that's what happened to me, and it happens to people like me every day." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I want to say is this. We all have a role to play in changing this. It's not enough to say you're not biased, you have to actively work against it. You have to stand up when you see injustice, even if it's uncomfortable." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Marcus. He concluded, "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that day, and I believe we can do better, but it starts with each of us." The crowd erupted into applause. Evelyn stood and embraced her son as he stepped off the stage, tears glistening in her eyes. In the months that followed, Evelyn's anti-bias training program was approved and implemented. Police officers attended workshops led by experts, and community leaders hosted dialogues to foster understanding. Marcus's story became a rallying point for change, inspiring local schools to adopt diversity education programs. Sarah became an active participant in the equity group, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. Slowly, she began to rebuild trust within the community. And Marcus, he joined his school's debate team, using his voice to advocate for justice and equality. His experience in Greenville Park had been traumatic, but it had also ignited a passion within him, a desire to make the world a better place. One conversation at a time, the events of that afternoon in Greenville Park were a wake-up call for the city. They exposed the deep-rooted biases that still existed but also showed the power of accountability, education, and courage. Change didn't happen overnight, but it began with a single moment, a single stand, and a single voice, as Marcus often reminded those who listened to his story. It's not enough to hope for change. You have to be the spark that starts it. The events at Greenville Park became more than just a confrontation. They became a turning point. What started as a moment of fear and injustice for Marcus evolved into a spark that ignited change across the city. Evelyn Bennett's unwavering stand as both a mother and a leader, Marcus's courage to speak his truth, And even Sarah Whitman's willingness to reflect on her actions served as reminders of the potential for growth and progress when people confront their biases and strive for understanding. This story is not just about one family, one community, or one incident. It reflects a universal struggle against prejudice and the need for systemic change. It reminds us that justice is not inevitable. It requires action, courage, and accountability from all of us. In a world where misunderstandings and prejudices can escalate into harm, this story offers lessons for how we can navigate and improve our shared humanity. Here are some key takeaways. Examine your biases. Prejudice often stems from unconscious biases. Take time to reflect on your own assumptions and challenge stereotypes that may influence your actions or decisions. Act with empathy. Before making judgments about others, put yourself in their shoes. A moment of compassion can prevent unnecessary conflict and foster mutual respect. Speak up against injustice. Silence in the face of wrongdoing perpetuates harm. Whether it's standing up for yourself or others, your voice can be a powerful tool for change. Educate yourself and others. Knowledge is a key weapon against ignorance. Learn about the experiences of people from different backgrounds and share what you learn to promote understanding. Foster community accountability. True progress requires collective effort. Support initiatives that combat discrimination and advocate for fairness, equality, and justice in your community. As Marcus's story shows, change starts with small actions, questioning a harmful thought, standing up for someone who has been wronged, or choosing to learn rather than judge. It's a journey that requires courage and humility, but it's also one of the most important journeys we can take as individuals and as a society. In the words of Evelyn Bennett, we cannot change the past, but we have the power to shape the future. Let's create a world where no child, no person, feels criminalized for simply existing. Let this story inspire each of us to do better. Not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. Change begins with you. Be the spark.